Okay, well, welcome. Good evening. I am Sue Baumgartner. I'm the president of Women in Philanthropy. We are delighted to have you all here for this event, and given the size of the audience, I'm guessing that this is a relevant topic for a few of us. So it's a delight. We are very fortunate to have a wonderful panel of very accomplished experts to discuss this topic, women and stress, the relationship between mind and body in wellness. And I think you'll find this a very informative discussion and very helpful, I think, as we move forward in our lives. This event is a collaboration between two co-sponsors, Women in Philanthropy, as well as the UCLA Division of Digestive Diseases in the David Geffen School of Medicine. Information on both programs is available on the tables outside, so we'd love to have you pick up information on either program or both programs. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the two sponsoring organizations just for a few minutes. First of all, Women in Philanthropy at UCLA. We celebrate and inspire women's giving across the UCLA campus, and we foster women's participation in various leadership boards on campus. We inspire women, we hope, to get leadership positions on the campus. Our group celebrates its 20th anniversary this year. Since 1994, our members have raised over $150 million for UCLA, touching nearly every corner of the campus. Our members include leaders who have roles on many of the advisory leadership groups here at UCLA and also hold positions within the UCLA Foundation. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's just a really exciting group of women to be around and to spend time with. The UCLA Division of Digestive Diseases in the David Geffen School of Medicine is dedicated to advancing the scientific knowledge and understanding of digestive disorders, improving patient care, and providing advanced training for future generations of clinicians and scientists in the field of gastrointestinal illnesses. Its diverse patient services are of the highest quality. Its premier faculty represent a wide range of expertise. Its technologies are pushing the boundaries of treatments, and its long history, 60 years, reflects an enviable track record of healthcare breakthroughs and accomplishments. The division continues to be rated, quote, best in the Western United States, end quote, and is ranked in the top 10 among digestive disease centers in the United States by U.S. News & World Report in its annual survey. Many of us have questions, and we know that there are many questions when it comes to women and men and stress. Is there a difference between the two when it comes to health and illness? Can we stay on the good side of stress? What do we understand about the link between stress and illness, aging, weight gain, or pain? How can we manage the effects of stress? Presenters on the panel are internationally recognized experts from the Gail and Gerald Oppenheimer Family Center for Neurobiology of Stress at UCLA, who will unravel the science on the interface between mind, brain, and body in health and disease, as well as novel approaches that can improve wellness. I'm going to briefly introduce the moderator of the panel, and then he will introduce the rest of the panel and lead the discussion. So I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Eric Israelian. He's the co-chief Division of Digestive Diseases at the David Geffen School of Medicine. Dr. Israelian attended the University of California at Berkeley and graduated with a major in integrative biology and a minor in English. He subsequently graduated from the Loma Linda University School of Medicine and completed a residency in internal medicine at the University of Southern California, which we will not hold against you. He was named intern, junior resident, and senior resident of the year during all 3 years of his residency training. He completed his gastroenterology fellowship at UCLA, where he also obtained a Master's of Public Health with the assistance of an NIH-sponsored training grant. Dr. Israelian is also a graduate of the Executive Program in Management from the UCLA Anderson School, which I'm pleased to see. In 2012, the School of Medicine awarded him the Lindsay Foundation Chair in Clinical Gastroenterology, and in 2013, he was named Chief of the Division of Digestive Diseases. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Israelian, who will lead about a 30-minute presentation by the panel. We'll have some question and answer, and then we'll invite you all to a reception in the lobby afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm already mic'd up, and I'm part of the Bruin family, despite that little detour. No, definitely, this is where the heart is. So thank you to Sue, and thank you to the entire Women in Philanthropy group. We're very fortunate to be with you tonight, and we really appreciate your participation. Very excited to share some of our insights with our really superstar faculty panel who are here today. And before I talk about them a little bit, I also want to thank, in addition to the team of Women in Philanthropy, Laurel Zeno from our division, who has embraced this opportunity, because we're really excited about sharing some of the work that's being done in the division with a broader part of the Bruin family. And we're really appreciative of what you've all done, you and your colleagues and friends have done for UCLA, because just like the other areas of campus, the Division of Digestive Diseases relies heavily on the support of our community. In this era of shrinking funding in government support and in other sources, we really rely heavily on our partners in the community, and we hope that you'll be our partners too in the future. So, has anybody in the room ever used the expression gut feelings? What about butterflies in your stomach? Have you ever been sick to your stomach? So these expressions are based on work that this esteemed group has performed and their colleagues, and I'm honored on behalf of Dr. Gary Gitnick, who's our chief as well in the Division of Digestive Diseases, to work with this group and introduce the panel today, because really these expressions that we use just in our everyday language are based on scientific facts. And that's the most fascinating part, I think, of what the group does, is basically take what we kind of take for granted, show the science behind it, and then try to move towards opportunities for better understanding and therapy to make our lives better. And there isn't a person in this room, or basically on this planet, who hasn't ever had some sort of digestive symptom related to the physiology behind all of this. And despite, as a good friend of mine always says, you mean to tell me we put a man on the moon, but whenever I get constipated, you tell me to drink prune juice? I mean, that's basically because our level of understanding is so simplistic, but we are now making great strides thanks to the work of this group and the Gail and Gerald Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress. And literally, some of the finest and most accomplished scientists in the whole world are right here, and they work in our division. They're at UCLA, and it's a pleasure. So I'm going to introduce our panel. We have three, again, the leadership of the Oppenheimer Center: Dr. Emran Mayer, Dr. Lin Chang, and Dr. Kirsten Tillish. And they all have, like I said, internationally renowned CVs, but more than that, they're fantastic clinicians and physicians and just caring people and colleagues. And it's my honor to introduce them. And then after we have our brief presentation, we'll take a little bit of a question and answer session and hope to get to know you a little bit better. So our first speaker is Dr. Mayer, and he'll introduce the subsequent speakers.
Thanks, Eric, for the kind introduction. And thanks to Sue and the group for inviting us to speak here and to present some of our exciting research. I have to disappoint you. I'm not going to be the speaker who will tell you what you can do practically when you go home to deal with your stress. You'll have to wait till the last speaker to fill in on this. So I'm going to bore you with a whirlwind tour through some of the exciting science that has changed this field really from something that was a fringe 15, 20 years ago, certainly when I started my career in medicine, to something that certainly at places like UCLA has become mainstream. Some of the things that you will be hearing in a very superficial way due to lack of time is something that you probably never even thought about. Other things are, you've probably read in the papers. This is a very popular topic in Time magazine and in the news media. So the topics that I want to touch on very briefly, introduce this concept: what is stress, the good and the bad. It's not only bad. If you didn't have a stress system, As a species, we would not have survived in evolution. Then I switched to something why it's surprising that our healthcare system has not really invested in optimal health and wellness, and how this goes all the way down to the scientific concepts that our traditional medicine is based on. What are the key components of optimal health or wellness? And then, probably a question of particular interest to this audience, are women more sensitive to stress? And then I just show a couple of slides about the healing brain. This is clearly the most exciting thing about this, that once you understand how these systems operate in health and how they get compromised in disease, can we harness the power of our intrinsic nervous system to counteract the ill effect of stress? So let me start with the good stress. So preparing the body for optimal functioning in the face of an imminent threat. So this is one of those threats that our ancestors were faced with on a daily basis, not just snakes, but also lions and other wild animals. And this is what happens instantaneously, and this happens in every species. Probably one of the most adaptive and valuable responses that our bodies and brains have evolved, namely this stress response system. And you see on the list, I won't go into the details of this, that activation of that system affects pretty much every cell in the body instantaneously. We have a program. This doesn't have to be reinvented every time. We have a program that's turned on instantaneously and provides an optimal situation for either fighting the stressor or running away, so the so-called fight and flight response. So this is the good stress. And what's important to know about this, when we are relaxed, we're not really at the peak of our performance. If you give a talk or if you want to perform optimally in a test, we want that our stress system pushes us way up there in this part of the curve, because our performance, cognitive performance, increases. However, if you're exposed to chronic, severe, frequent stresses, then this system is activated beyond the point of optimal performance, and this is shown up here. So fatigue sets in. Probably if I ask the question, how many people in this room have experienced fatigue or are regularly fatigued, probably the majority would put their hands up. So early indication that you are probably operating close to that deflection point. But if the stress persists beyond that, then there was clearly this phenomenon of stress overload, burnout. And it's not only that we feel different, our entire body changes, and you can, without going into details, a whole set of hormones, there's an increase in stress hormones, decrease in these female anti-stress chemicals. I'll come back to this. And this phenomenon is called allostatic load. So the load on the body with either regularly repeated mild stressors or severe stressors or persistent, or most typically, I think in our world, it's the chronic unrelenting stress. So just one example, there's many examples if you go through the newspapers of prominent individuals that have fallen from grace, the way they looked before and after. This is clearly a face of somebody under allostatic load. And typically also, this individual was treated for his GI tract, rather than saying, okay, this is an individual that comes to the clinic with a syndrome of allostatic load or overload. So if you transform this into how our health system is dealing with the after effects of allostatic load, you can see that the majority of our efforts are really invested in this portion where medicine basically is at its best. We call it healthcare, but really at the moment it's still disease care. It's phenomenally expensive. These numbers go up every year, projected with the obesity epidemic to go even beyond 20%. Per capita, per patient expense is tremendous. And we're not really spending a significant amount of time on the other side of this bell-shaped curve. I think we have, the medical system has shifted this emphasis somewhat over into the middle, into these in this area of pre-disease. Can we detect something before it becomes a major problem? But very few people, neither in research nor in the clinic, have really studied individuals on this part of the curve, this optimal health, aging without cognitive decline, without physical decline, a state of complete physical, psychological, spiritual, and social well-being. I would hope that if the current trend continues, that the emphasis both in research and in therapy will move much more over to this side. I can almost guarantee you that the cost of close to $10,000 a patient will decrease dramatically if you're able to bring people further over on this side of the curve. So why is it that we're so focused on this disease care model? Well, this is a picture from the 1930s. So viewing the human body as a mechanical device with replaceable parts, so very good in transplanting parts when they're broken down, which can be fixed with medication. So clearly, the mechanical model of the body, and in this case, the brain-gut interactions, is what's underlying our focus on disease care. So what has happened starting probably in the 60s, but now has really become mainstream, as I mentioned earlier, the rediscovery of many concepts, these wellness teachings of traditional healing traditions, such as traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and all these systems, you can look at how they view the mind, brain, body, and they're very similar. They look at it as an integrated energy system. This is an example of these chakras. That disease is a disturbance of the balance within this energy system, and therapy is restoring the balance or strengthening it to have a increased resilience against disease. And the most amazing thing, most of you probably have not thought about this or being aware of this, the systems that are now happening almost on a revolutionary speed is that science is basically subscribing to the same kind of concepts, that everything is connected. The body is an integrated supercomputer, which can only be understood if you understand the whole system, not the individual parts. So this transition from the 1930s to now, and now I would say the last less than 5 years have really taken over. It's a paradigm shift in science. It's kind of a remarkable recognition that what these people over thousands of years have based on their observations actually has a scientific basis. So let me just give you, without going into any details of this, a model of how this is applied now to the brain and the GI tract, and something that probably many of you have read in magazines or heard on NPR about the gut microbiome. These 100 trillion organisms, microorganisms that live in our gut, and that this system, it also involves the immune system. So 3 regulatory systems: the brain, the nervous system, the immune system, and these microbiome, which are connected not only with each other, but also with the world. And I'm going to show you this in which way I mean this. So this ecological loop, stress, social support, exercise, by which we interact with the outside world, has a major influence, both positive and negative, on the brain, which is probably the main driver in this system. But also other factors from the outside world, diet, pathogens, and the frequent intake of antibiotics, we now understand, or beginning to understand, have, through influencing the activity of this super system in our intestine that we never even thought about until about 5 years ago, have a major influence not just on the immune system, but also back into the brain. So if you want to understand an abnormality at the brain level, at the immune system level, we have to take all of these into account in a massive computer model, which is happening. UCLA is actually, and the Digestive Disease Division, one of the leaders in this systems biology approach to GI disorders and to medicine. We've talked a lot about the brain as one of these central regulators. And you could almost say, and I'll give you a couple more examples in a minute, that our main wellness regulator is the brain, and it's programmed throughout life by interactions between genes and environment. So this is illustrated here. You have genes, the influence, there's gene expression, influences circuits within the brain that drive certain brain functions. Particularly important for health, I would say, is the resilience system, and for stress, the stress system. And then the output of this to the rest of that system that I showed in the previous slide determines overall wellness and chronic disease. So not everybody has the same system. So what happens, the gene expression is influenced not just by our genes, but also by things that happen in the first 15 to 18 years of life, early adverse life events, a very hot topic because we now understand all the way down to the molecular biology of how that influences gene expression, low socioeconomic status, nutrition. Again, I put the antibiotics there because we think that has probably a major, frequent use of antibiotics in childhood, a major effect. Then during life in the adult, this allostatic load we talked about earlier, the chronic stress, and the low socioeconomic status, and an unhealthy diet all will influence these systems and ultimately will lead to this chronic disease model shifting on that bell curve way over into the disease care range. On the other hand, we also understand, and this is both from animal studies and humans, that a stable early environment and the early development of these resilient systems, both in your gut microbiota, but also at the brain level, as well as during life, during adult life, social support systems, the healthy diet, exercise, and healthy mind states. Compassion is one that has been studied even with brain scanning by some individuals, and the Dalai Lama has been involved in some of those studies. So let me say a few things about how this whole system that I explained to you, so in very simplistic concepts, why is it different in women? So are women more sensitive to chronic stress? One could say yes, initially, because women are overrepresented in many stress-sensitive disorders. Not all of them, but I just list a few here: chronic pain syndromes, affective disorders, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and obesity. I think Lynn will give you some more specific examples about this later. But on the other hand, healthy women, compared to men, it's some sort of a paradox. They produce more of these anti-stress chemicals in the brain. Oxytocin, you may have heard about this, directly antagonizes your stress system. Estrogen and endorphins. So they have a natural protection against the stressors that men do not have. Men will always engage the fight and flight response. Women do not, because that system keeps that suppressed. They show better coping strategies under stress. Very influential book by Shelley Taylor here at UCLA in psychology, The Tending Instinct, highly recommend this. So they, under stress, develop this behavior of tend and befriend instead of fight and run away. They show healthier responses to physical symptoms. They see a doctor earlier and have to even drag their husbands into the clinic. And as everybody knows, they show a much greater ability to endure severe pain. Men even barely can stand a flu shot, and women undergo the childbirth. So there must be something fundamental about the female brain that is really protective against stressors. And this is something that we found in our own studies. So then why would they be overrepresented amongst chronic stress disorders? So this is something often not mentioned in studies. There was clearly a tremendous bias when I started my career. It was always the neurotic housewives who developed these chronic stress related disorders. Women are definitely exposed to a much greater stress load. I mean, this may be changing now with changing roles of women and changing role models for men and husband and wives. So the societal expectations, they have to take care not only of like working moms, not only of their job, but also still continue to take care of their households and children. Single moms, single working moms, even higher. If you had to sort of give a number to this, you would say it's twice the stress that an individual like that undergoes. And then often also caretaker of older spouses. A major stress, we know that induces this allostatic response. then there's a certain risk factor. So despite these anti-stress chemicals, the female brain, and we know this from our own research, exhibits this greater emotional reactivity than the male brain. The male brain will always filter it through the prefrontal cortex in a cognitive fashion. Women will show greater responsiveness, both healthy women and women with various stress-related disorders, a greater engagement of, we call this emotional arousal circuitry. This is a particularly interesting one. So a lot of life and the function of the brain has to do with prediction about future events. For all of our evolution, it was advantageous for female animals or women to anticipate a higher risk because that would guarantee a higher success rate of either escaping that threat or... So this prediction error, they have a slight bias towards a greater likelihood of a negative outcome. It was something that probably has contributed to our survival as a species. But in the modern world, where we don't need this really, it's probably one of the major. And so I can tell this, I highlight it because we find this in our own research, looking at the brain with brain imaging techniques. Okay, so I'm getting to the end. What I tried to explain to you, so there's been a dramatic, like an explosion of our understanding, not only of the role that the brain plays in these large, very large integrated systems, being tightly linked to the immune system and to these microbiota in the gut. Watch out for the NPR story. They recently came here and interviewed all of us, our center, for a special and morning edition on this role of the microbiota and food that feeds these microbiota on the brain. All these things are positive. We know there's ongoing studies that exercises like yoga, meditation, other mind-based therapies have both functional and structural effects on the brain. They can restore some of the systems that are compromised by chronic stress. This has been amazing that for many years now, there's been much more interested in the lay press and coverage than in medical curricula or textbooks. Probably hasn't made it into textbooks at all at this point. And so I've come to the end. You have in your handout, for us, this has only been possible really through support of many people, in addition, besides the Oppenheimer family. It has allowed us to build up a program, a center with various programs. I've just listed those. You have in your handouts a brief description of each of these programs, which will give an idea of the depth and breadth. So I'm sure I'm way over my allotted time, and I'll hand it over to Eric to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Emran. So our next speaker is Dr. Lynn Chang, and she's the director of the clinical care program, and she will kind of build on what Dr. Emran Mayer was talking about. We'll go from there. Those are Dr. Tillish's children. Two of them, 2 out of the 3.
Sorry, I can't find my
Got it?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. And then we'll take questions afterwards.
So welcome, everyone. I am a gastroenterologist, and my area of research is in IBS and other chronic pain syndromes. And I've been particularly interested in stress because I actually see it when I take care of patients. The 2 aspects that I really see is that many times early in life, patients have been exposed to some early adverse life adversity, like abuse, mental illness in the parents, or psychiatric disease, witnessing general trauma. And many times, looking through the literature, and something I've been studying is it predisposes individuals. Not everyone that gets it, it happens to them, but it predisposes them to getting chronic illnesses, and I'll discuss that later. And then the other thing that I always see in my patients is many times stressful events will lead to the onset of the symptoms or an exacerbation of symptoms. So I realize that stress does play a large role, and even though I study it more for the gut and for the gastrointestinal disease, my talk was going to give you more information how stress can affect our body. So it's a little bit more of a general talk. And I picked some examples that I thought maybe people would be interested in. So as Emran mentioned before, stress is where you have a perturbation. So you don't have your equilibrium, your balance. Your homeostasis is off. And this can occur with you being aware of it or not even being aware of it. And many times if you are aware of it, it's associated with anxiety, stress, or anger feelings. It can be acute, something that happens in a very short period of time, or it can be chronic. It can be sustained, or it's at least 3 months or longer. And it can range from just some daily hassles. I drive a long distance every day. I don't even know how I do it. Driving in traffic every day, or to actually a life-threatening event. So what happens with stress is it takes this wear and tear that Emran was mentioning, and usually with our resiliency, we're able to get back to our baseline state again. But sometimes what happens, if it just keeps going on and on, you get wear and tear, eventually it's going to break down. And sometimes it's the straw that broke the camel's back. It doesn't even seem like something major happened, but the body was primed to get that breakdown. And so then once you get that breakdown, you reach your allostatic load. And your body can no longer get back to its homeostatic state, its equilibrium, even though it's trying desperately to get back there. And that's when people start developing some symptoms and eventually a disorder or disease. So you saw this slide before, and what I always see, and I see in a lot of my patients, that they have the demand for performance for whatever they need to do. And I do believe in good stress. I definitely think it makes us more efficient. It definitely has a benefit. But there is a fine line, because when I see patients, they're down on this side of the curve. So they were performing, sometimes overshooting actually, and they fall down to the other side. And they try to go back up, and even when you start feeling like you make progress, if you go too fast, you come tumbling down again. So it's really important to take your time and to try to gradually get back to the state that you're at. And I always tell my patients that we're highly resilient, and it takes a lot to eventually get those symptoms. They may not realize it, but it actually takes them a long time to get that breakdown. And so it's so hard to reverse it so quickly. It does take time, because it took a lot longer than you probably realized to get to that state. So when we have stress, there's two main stress systems that get activated. One is our cortisol system. Our cortisol, that stress hormone, will increase. There's also adrenaline, the other stress hormone, and that's part of the sympathetic fight or flight system that you just heard about. And both of those get activated in stress. But it's not so good. At that time, acute time, it's good. It helps us make us more protective to defend against whatever threat we have. But long term, having these high levels, it's not so good for the body. So I talked about early adverse life events. Well, these are all the health effects it can have. Obesity, high blood pressure, mood disorders like anxiety or depression, asthma, autoimmune disease like lupus, chronic pain disorders, irritable bowel syndrome, which I take care of, prescription drug use or recreational drug use. Now, again, just because you had an early adverse life event, it doesn't mean that you're going to have one of these effects, but it makes you more susceptible to having it. So I want to talk about how stress plays a role in certain symptoms or conditions. So first, stress and pain. Well, why do we get a chronic pain disorder when we're under stress for a long period of time? And that's because our pain sensitivity actually increases. We may think we have a high pain tolerance, but our sensitivity actually increases. And it's because of the way that information is processed that we consciously are aware of it. We're more bothered by it. But we also have very protective pain inhibitory systems that dampen what pain we feel. But those systems don't get actively engaged. So we feel more pain. And so a lot of chronic pain syndromes develop when we're under stress. Chronic abdominal pain, fibromyalgia, where we have muscle pain, migraine headaches, temporomandibular joint disorder, we have jaw pain, chronic fatigue syndrome that's often associated with pain, and interstitial cystitis or painful bladder syndrome. And these are just some of the chronic pain disorders that we can all get if we're under a lot of stress, because our pain threshold actually lowers. Well, what about weight gain? So I did a lot of looking into this, because many people will say that when they're under stress, they'll actually gain weight. And obesity has been associated with weight gain. So there was a study, and there's several studies, but I'll give you more information, where there was a nurse practitioner program, and they were all under stress during their studies. And then they measured cortisol levels, and they also measured how much did the patient perceive, the nurse practitioner student perceive that they had a control over things that were happening in their life. And they found that they looked at other factors as well. but they found that these two were the most important factors that determined if they gained weight during their educational program. And what they found that mediated that was they had less reduction in dietary restraint. So when their cortisol went up, they felt also less control over what was going on in their life. It caused them to have less restraint over what they ate, and that caused them to gain weight. But I looked into this more, and when cortisol gets up high in the body, what it will do is it'll stimulate your appetite. It will also change the way you metabolize fats and carbohydrates. It'll change the way insulin works in the body and controls the blood sugar level. And if you become more insulin resistant, it's like having diabetes. You go into something called metabolic syndrome. And it also causes poor sleep. And poor sleep has been associated with changing our appetite and changing our eating behaviors. And something else that was really interesting. So when we get under stress, our stress hormone, like cortisol, gets activated. But when it gets down to our tissues, it's actually an inactivated state. And the fat cells contain an enzyme that will convert cortisol from an inactive form to an active form. So this enzyme gets highly expressed, it increases. So it's converting it to cortisol. So when cortisol gets activated, it's actually been associated with more weight gain and obesity and having more fat, particularly in the trunk. So these are some ways that cortisol under stress can cause weight gain. What about early aging? Well, stress has been associated with early aging. They've shown that job stress, particularly when you're exhausted, so I'm telling the chiefs that. Okay, job stress isn't good for us. Okay. Anticipating stress, stress-related sleep deprivation. So stress hormones have been associated with aging of the brain, but particularly more in women than in men. And stress hormones can cause vision and hearing loss. So, we have our genes on our DNA that are on chromosomes. And there's these protein complexes at the ends of the DNA, at these chromosomes, and they're called telomeres. And when we age, those telomeres that protect the DNA from damage actually get shortened. So it doesn't protect the DNA as much, and the DNA is allowed to age. So when we're under stress, those telomeres that are protecting the DNA get shortened. They don't protect the DNA, and that cell now has early aging. And that's how it's thought that stress causes our tissues to age earlier than they should. Well, what about this? What about turning gray? I love President Obama, and I feel so bad. 1 year later, his hair's so gray. And you see this in all the presidents, right? Highly stressful job. Well, we know that stress can cause hair loss, and we know that stress actually causes more pigmentation on the skin. We get these skin spots. So the question is, does stress really cause graying of the hair? And it turns out that genetics really play an important role. But when you're under stress, if you're genetically predisposed to having graying of your hair, stress accelerates that. But there was also a very interesting study that just was published in Nature Medicine this year, and it was really in animals. But what they found out was that when you're under stress and you have these stress hormones released, and you have any bodily harm or injury, stem cells that make these cells that make melanin, and melanin is the pigment for our skin and for our hair. And when you're under stress, those stem cells preferentially go from our hair follicles to our skin, so that we'll have pigmentation on our skin to protect us from this injury in our body. But when it takes the melanin out from our hair, it makes our hair lose color, right? And it becomes gray. So that's what happens under stress. So just to summarize, when we have chronic stress or recurrent stress, it has that wear and tear on the body. We break down our adaptive systems, our immune system, our cardiovascular, our neuroendocrine. They start to break down. And when they get breakdown, we have this dysregulation, and then we get physiologic changes, biologic changes, and then we get symptoms, and we eventually get disease. And then our overall well-being is decreased. So even though this was kind of the bad news part of the presentation, you'll hear the good news. But I will tell you that knowledge is power, right? And by knowing this will empower you to recognize, because I think all the time, what's going on in my body when I'm under stress? But it empowers you to either try to prevent it from happening, be proactive, but also recognizing and trying to treat what you're experiencing. So thank you for your attention.
So-
Our last speaker is Dr. Tiller.
I'm pleased that I get to be the bearer of good news. And I'm going to try to make my 10 minutes because I know we've gone over. For me, to talk about these therapies in 10 minutes is kind of like showing you just one picture of my kids. I could go on and on. But I'm going to talk about how we potentially can tame some of this stress with mind-body interventions. So we've talked a lot about the impact on stress. And there are different types of stress. And I think often when I talk to patients, they say, I'm not stressed. I feel good. I'm happy. I'm not stressed. Because they're not having that emotional stress. When we think about stress, we often think about that emotional stress. But there are all the other stresses that are going on at the same time. So work, school, cognitive stress, thinking hard about a problem is good stress, but it also impacts the body. Physical stress, the stresses of aging, and environmental stresses. So like Lynn mentioned, driving in the car for an hour, both ways to work, that's an incredible environmental stressor on the mind and the body. And it leads to all these vague symptoms that really led me into this area of research, these symptoms that we don't treat very well as physicians, but that most of us develop at some point in our lives. So if we're going to talk about mind-body interventions, we have to then accept that the brain is attached to the body. And Western medicine has sort of tried to deny that for a long time. We have a different hospital for our brain. For psychiatry, they want to be in their own institution. But really, we're attached, and it all goes together. And what's interesting is, though we often feel helpless about what goes on in our body, so we're feeling pain, our immune system is low, our gastrointestinal function is upset, our heartbeat is fast, our blood pressure is out of control, feel like you can't catch your breath. These are not things that we're completely out of control with. These are things that occur whether we think about them or not, but when we do think about them and we actually accept that we have some power over them and learn how to manipulate them, we can actually improve those things. So we can tap into our abilities to improve how we feel, reduce stress, increase our resilience, and improve our mood, thus enhancing our quality of life. Now, when I say reduce stress, often people just say, well, yeah, you're saying that I should, get rid of the things in my life that stress me out. No, we actually have often little capacity to do that. A lot of these things in our life are fixed. We can't get rid of all of our stressors. We need to learn to allow our bodies to function differently in the presence of the stressors that we have. Certainly if we can change some things, great. But some of the things we don't even want to change. I don't want to make my work less stressful. I like the way it is. But how I interact with it can be different. So I'm going to talk about a couple different mind-body therapies that are really focused on meditation. Meditation is really this ancient technique of self-healing. And I'm not going to talk about the spiritual aspect or religious aspect that often goes along with meditation. I'm going to talk more about the health aspects of it. The nice thing about meditation is you can do it anywhere. And though if you'd asked me this maybe, 10 years ago, anyone can do meditation. I always said, I can't meditate. I'm too hyper. I'm too stressed. I'm an anxious type A person. I can't meditate. No way. But, if I can meditate, anyone can meditate. And it really, even for someone who has that type of personality, can learn how to clear the mind. It's incredibly beneficial. Relaxes the nervous system. It can have beneficial effects on the body. Even, as Lynn talked about the telomeres that age our cells, even have been shown to reduce that cellular aging. Even short doses. Some of these studies being done here at UCLA. We know that meditators have different brains. So people who do long-term meditation, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of meditation, if you look at their brains compared to someone who hasn't meditated, they have increased blood flow, particularly in the front of the brain where we have most of our cognitive control over things. They have greater brain volumes in some of these areas, and interestingly, when looking at a cognitive task, they do better on these cognitive tasks the greater volume they have in this area. And what I love to hear is actually in multiple regions throughout the brain. All those areas in green on the brain show that people who are long-term meditators have slower aging within the brain. So keeping resilience within the brain. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is a way that often I help patients come into dealing with the sort of difficulty of I can't sit and just do nothing, meditation. John Kabat-Zinn developed this program, MBSR, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, in the late 70s to bring it into medicine in a secular way and in a structured way that those of us who are from a Western society can understand. There's a teacher, there's homework, there's lesson plans. It's in our realm. It's not go sit and, chant. So it's very structured, but it brings those basic concepts to us that involve changing our awareness, reducing judgment to our thoughts and emotions, and promoting well-being. And by doing these things, research has shown that over the many years people have been doing this in hospitals and now broadly in the community, there have been studies showing people can reduce pain in irritable bowel syndrome, which we study. Patients benefit. Helps depression, anxiety, psoriasis. So people often forget the skin's attached to the brain too. When we're stressed, we get skin rashes, we get breakouts. Psoriasis can be improved, and blood pressure. In the science of MBSR, I want to just highlight a couple things that I think are really relevant. So recent study of patients with Parkinson's disease, which is a really disabling and difficult neurologic disease, a course of this MBSR has shown that compared to people who got usual care, so everyone got the usual medicines for Parkinson's, those patients who also had this 3 months of treatment with meditation had increases in volume in several regions of their brain that are important to Parkinson's. So what we call the basal ganglia, that's where Parkinson's is originated. Those volumes increased. The hippocampus, where we have our memory, those volumes were increased. And the amygdala, where we often process fear and anxiety. So very relevant changes to see. And these are early studies, but are really suggestive that in some of these illnesses where our drugs are helpful, but don't really manage the entire picture, we may have these adjunctive treatments by harnessing the power of the mind to help us be more resilient. Because it's Veterans Day coming up, a lot of mind-body treatments are being used in our veterans who are coming back post-deployment with incredible stress. Some with mental illness, some just with a lot of stress. So in one study of post-deployment stress in veterans, they underwent MBSR. And even in this severe population that was being seen in the clinic for mental illness, they had improvements in their stress, their depression, and their sleep quality, which is probably one of the most important factors. Because without good sleep, which is a problem for many of the veterans, without good sleep, you can't restore yourself and get better. Yoga is another way at this same concept of focusing the mind and relaxation. We often think of yoga as an exercise, and sometimes it's practiced that way. But really, when practiced in a way to be restorative, it brings in these same concepts that meditation does. Focused attention and a goal of attaining a peaceful mind. With that, we also get the benefits of strengthening and aligning the body, and it's sort of an extra benefit there. It's been shown to improve these same things that meditation does. A little bit less data on yoga, but it's increasing. Tai Chi is another way at the same thing, and Tai Chi is one that I like to refer patients to who are having some difficulty with exercise and balance in particular. We often assume that if we start to lose balance a little bit, that's something, like I noticed this. I mean, I'm in my 40s, but I noticed, gosh, if I close my eyes, I just don't feel as steady as I used to be. And I made a point of really trying to bring back my balance because we don't want to age and have difficulty feeling our feet on the ground and feeling stable. This is a practice that allows improved balance by strengthening those brain connections. If you don't use it, you're going to lose those. If you use them at any age, you're able to strengthen those connections and improve. So at any level of strength, Tai Chi can be really helpful. And again, decreases inflammation, improves immune function, and then it helps mood, in addition to those physical aspects. There are a lot of other modalities that are mind-body modalities for stress reduction. They're the ones that I've talked about have the most research behind them, but they all harness the same sort of things. And the one that we actually are practicing over in Ronald Reagan, which I get the most sort of giggles about, is aromatherapy. People say, aromatherapy, that's the silliest one. It does the same thing. So when there is a scent, scents activate our brain very strongly, and they focus our attention. So for our patients who are in the hospital, who just feel terrible, to have a scent that can gather their attention in a way that few things can activate the brain, can actually improve how they feel, can improve nausea, can improve mood, can help sleep. They've done some studies in horses, actually, where they looked at horses who were put in a stressful environment and monitored their nervous system, their blood pressure, and their heart rate. And then they did a comparison between horses just in the stressful environment and then stressed horses with lavender scent being infused. And they saw that the blood pressure and the heart rate were lower when they were in the environment with the lavender. So these basic things in our environment we can harness to actually help us improve. And there are a number of these other therapies. So the good news is we can harness this power, and we can become more resilient, and we can make ourselves feel better. But there are incredible barriers to success that we have to acknowledge if we're going to move forward and do that. We have to realize that we do have this innate power. We have to accept that. And with that, the responsibility that we can actually improve our health, and that it's not going to be just going to the doctor and getting a prescription. We have to value that ability to have. And then we have to invest the same kind of effort that we invest into our jobs and other aspects of our lives to do that. And I think for many of us, that is tricky. So often, I was brought up with this, the sort of typical values. We help others. We work hard. We value action. We value strength, power, success, these things. This is what got us all here, right? Is these values. But we're not always taught to value with the same degree of intensity. Self-care. If we don't take care of ourselves, we're not going to be able to help anyone else. We're going to be, where Lynn talked about, we're going to be at the bottom of that curve. Contemplation, not just action. We have to sit and think. We have to rest. We have to not only be strong, we have to be flexible, not just physically, but emotionally and intellectually. Bring spirituality and really bring acceptance. When things fail, we need to accept them and then make a plan to move on. So we need to bring another value system to improving. I bet everyone in this room knows that there is such a thing as yoga and there is such a thing as meditation or Tai Chi, and many people have even tried some of them, but it's the intensity and the intention that needs to be brought to them to really make them succeed. And as you can see from the science, they can. So we can put that guy to sleep, that stress to sleep. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kirsten. I don't know if you could tell, but both with Dr. Chang and Dr. Tillich, their voices are so calming. I'm very relaxed just sitting up here. No offense to Emran, but they definitely have a soothing way about the discussion. And, I think, one of the things as I'm listening, and I've heard a lot of their research and their lectures before, but it's very interesting because I think all of us can learn from this. And looking at the scales that Dr. Tillich just put up there, I realize that many of us in this room probably spend a lot of time worrying about others and caring for others, but not really focused attention caring for ourselves. And it's like when you're on the airplane, they tell you to put the oxygen on yourself first. Otherwise, you're not going to even be awake enough to give oxygen to other people. So I wanted to kick off the questions and ask one question that really ties in a few of the concepts that you all discussed was, at UCLA, I think all of you have kind of taught us to look at all of the different possibilities of contributing factors towards these conditions that many of us face. Is it too simplistic to think about one factor? Because, obviously, sometimes we treat patients with antibiotics, for example, for irritable bowel syndrome, or we tell patients to work on their exercise to kind of incorporate a lot of these therapies that you've mentioned. I mean, how do you kind of break down when you see an individual patient, what is the dominating trigger and how to guide them in that? I mean, what's your thought process? And maybe all of you could kind of explain that because everybody has a different approach. Emran, how do you approach a patient who comes to you with a lot of these common symptoms? What about you, Lynn? How do you approach this?
Well, because you were asking really, what do you think are the main factors that play a role in the patient's presentation and their symptoms, right? And I think it's harder in a tertiary care population. The patients usually have more severe illness, so it gets more complicated because after they develop the condition and they have it for a long time, it actually starts snowballing. So then you start getting other symptoms, and then it's hard to tell what was the initial issue. But I always look at, from a holistic standpoint, what are all the factors that could play a role? So I always think about genetic predisposition and environmental factors. I keep it very open-ended. I always ask patients what they came here for, and I like to hear the whole story. So I want to know what's the main symptoms they have. But I always like to start at the beginning. Like, when did it first start? And what I start doing is I start painting a picture of the person and their life and their behaviors and their attitudes and what they've done and what do they think play a role. And I think if you allow that person to speak, they become very open and engaged, and they'll give more information. I think it can be very helpful. If a patient at some point gets a little emotional, then I know whatever they're talking about is really important. Mm-hmm. And I think that is always what is one of the main drivers of their particular illness.
What about you, Kristen? I mean,
I think even with like a simple thing that we might see, say somebody comes in with heartburn, and we have really good, effective, simple therapies for heartburn. Even that kind of interaction can be one where I think what Lynn said is really important. We have to then look at the person. Their heartburn medications over the counter. Why did they choose to come in and not take what they could buy at the store? Is it because they have a particular fear? Did somebody recently die in their family of an esophageal cancer? Often people don't come to you and say that, but is there something behind it? Is it because they don't want to take medicine and they want to see, often when they come to me, they want to do something else, right, and they want to find out something else. So I think we have a lot of great medicines, we have tools, but we have to use those tools in the context of the entire person and not just a symptom, an organ.
Great. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Let's take one over there.
Thank you for this panel. My question. Thank you for this panel. It's been phenomenal. My question is, if someone has experienced chronic stress over a number of years, how much of that damage is reversible? How many yoga sessions will it take to, just asking that, chuckling, but will the cortisol go down? What's the expectations?
Does anyone want to take that one?
I mean, that's a great question because it's one that we get asked quite a bit. I think Lynn touched on this. It's taken a long time to get there. It's going to take a long time to back up from it. And I don't think we have an answer to say, if you had 100 points of stress, we can get rid of 50. It's an evolution of continued healing. And for each person, it's going to be different. Sometimes we see people who have such incredible resilience and bounce back very quickly. Other people, it's a slow process, and we have to try multiple different things. And what I think is important to try is not just say one thing at a time. Go at it from multiple angles. So from a medical angle, trying to manage symptoms, from a psychological and spiritual angle, from a physical angle with things like exercise that are going to help rebuild the body. So really trying to go at each direction rather than just focusing on one particular symptom.
You know, just had this conversation with my patient today. She kind of asked me the same question, but she didn't ask it with stress. She just said, when am I going to be back to my normal state again? Because I think that a lot of people don't actually recognize that stress has played a role. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But I think that if it's mild and it's shorter term, it's probably easier to go back to your baseline state. But I think when you get to a point where it's prolonged and a lot of things have happened, it's very hard to get back to the original state. Because again, it took a long time to get there. So what I always say is you're trying to build your reserve, right? So instead of your 10% reserve, you're trying to build it to 20% or 30%. But I gave her this example, and I don't know if this is a great example. But if you have a car and it's in perfect mint condition, but you get an accident and you try to repair it, maybe a big accident, you repair it. So now it looks fine and it's running, but it's never running completely the way it was running originally, but it's still functioning. So it takes that little hit. But I think that if a person can do the things they can to make them as functional as possible, and it takes a long time to learn that too, they can get back to a very good state again. But they're never going to be probably perfect like they were before it all started. Not that they were perfect, because maybe they were more predisposed, but you know what I'm saying.
We have another question.
One question I have is, could there be a genetic aspect to high anxieties in a family? And if there is that, how much help would meditation, yoga, and so on, when this is something that a family might have, prevailing? And the
Love
other thing
to
is,
answer that
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So absolutely, families, anxiety runs in families, chronic pain runs in families, and those are probably genetic, maybe microbiome associated, and also sort of behavioral things that kind of come together. And one of our big interests, I mean, really the reason I do this work is to try to figure out how we can go ahead, find out who are these people who are at risk, and start early. Instead of, like your question, if someone has had 20 years of stress, it takes us a lot of work. But if we can say, you know what, you're from a family at risk, stress will probably affect you more. Let's intervene early and bring these resilient behaviors in before you even have a problem. That's where we'll be able to prevent chronic diseases more. So our big interest is looking at how can we identify these people, who's at risk, and how can we prevent, because that's really going to be the key, getting to our kids.
So before we head off to the reception, we have one more question, and then we'll have some time to speak outside.
I do, and thank you so much for tonight. And you and I can talk later because I come from a highly genetic predisposed family for stress and anxiety and depression, and meditation has been my very good friend. With that said, I also work as a psychotherapist, and I've been talking with my clients for years about the mind-body connection. And you've all talked about compassion and being compassionate with yourself and really reducing your stress on your mind and your body. Can I safely say that something as simplistic as self-talk also has an extraordinary effect? And bringing people into awareness of what they are saying to themselves all day actually has an enormous effect? Huge. Okay.
Huge. So negative hypnotic suggestion
Yes.
is what, I had one of my patients, I always teach that to sort of my patients. Did you hear what you just said?
Yeah.
And in one of my patients, it was a great success for me. She was doing fantastic. And she said, I finally gotten so I can take this medication. It's not bothering me. And I said, good. I hope that lasts. Some people say they get tired of the taste. And she said, don't you give me a negative hypnotic suggestion. And I was like, I did. Thank you.
Don't you love when they turn it on you?
She's so right, because patients tell themselves, I'm not going to get better. I'm not going to get better. Tomorrow could be worse. They really can turn it around and say, I think I'm doing pretty well today.
Or
I can do better.
Even the family messages
And
we
families
got,
too,
like,
sure.
I'm just stupid, I'm not ever going to win, I'm just stupid, and I think people have that running in their head and aren't even aware
Not at
it's
all.
there. So thank you that something as simplistic as self-talk, you all said it makes a huge difference. Thank you.
Okay, I want to say on behalf of all of us, this has been phenomenal, and we thank you all very, very much, and thank you, and we hope that you'll join us in the reception. We can talk a little bit more.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here. Thank you. That's so good.
Before everybody.